She was dragged into court without a lawyer, humiliated in front of the world, and left completely alone against the influence of the rich. Everyone believed she was guilty because the word of the wealthy carried more weight than her tears and her truth. A humble maid who had worked for years serving a powerful billionaire family was suddenly accused of stealing a priceless jewel. Sephi Arins adjusted the collar of her faded navy dress as she walked up the grand steps of the courthouse. Each step echoed in her ears like the ticking of a clock that had been counting down to this moment for months. The cold air outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. The city of Lagos had long been a place where the haves and the have-nots walked past each other as though worlds apart. But today, Sephi was not invisible. The headlines had ensured her name would be known, not as the diligent housekeeper of the prestigious Okonkwo family, but as a woman accused of stealing the Okonkwo's priceless emerald brooch. Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm. She had no lawyer, no representation, only the cold knowledge that the weight of the world and a false accusation hung over her. Her mind flashed back to the last time she saw the brooch, the night the house seemed to hold its breath. The Okonkwo family's treasures were sacred, locked away behind layers of security. And yet, the brooch had disappeared, and Sephi was the one blamed for it. It had been the night of the charity gala. The staff had been busy with last-minute preparations, and Sephi had been assigned to ensure that the Okonkwo family's prized possessions were safe. She remembered the sound of her footsteps echoing in the hallway, the soft hum of the mansion's grand piano in the background, but it was the sound of something or someone in the hallway that had caught her attention. A shadow had crossed the threshold of the study, and when Sephi looked up, she saw Madame Moreo disappearing down the corridor, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Sephi didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it wasn't unusual for Moreo to wander through the house late at night. But now, in the courtroom, those steps seemed like a piece of the puzzle she hadn't yet connected. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as Sephi took her seat at the defense table. The rich mahogany wood, the high ceilings, and the cold, impersonal architecture of the room made her feel small, insignificant. On the other side, Madame Moreo Okonkwo, the matriarch of the family, sat with a proud, imperious air. Her lips were thin, her eyes cold as she stared across the room at Sephi. Her son, Teo Okonkwo, was seated beside her. His jaw was clenched, and his hands rested stiffly at his sides. Teo had remained distant, aloof, since the accusation had been made. But something in his posture, the way his gaze kept flicking toward Sephi, told a different story. How long will it take for you to admit what you've done? Moreo's voice cut through the tension like a knife. This is about more than a brooch, Sephi. It's about honor. It's about what you've stolen from us. The word struck like a slap, and Sephi's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? The evidence was stacked against her. The prosecutors had done their job. She was the one with access. She was the one who had been in the vault the night the brooch had gone missing. But there was more to this story, more than the accusations that could be proven. The doors of the courtroom opened, and a ripple of surprise passed through the room as a young man entered. Kelechi Okonkwo, Teo's estranged son, stepped into the courtroom. He was tall, striking, and carried himself with a quiet defiance. The tension in the room shifted as he walked toward the witness stand, his gaze briefly locking with Sephi's. Kelechi took the stand, his voice strong but tinged with a subtle bitterness. My father has always been loyal to this family, but he's also been loyal to something else, a truth he can't admit. His words hung in the air, laced with accusation. He looked directly at Teo, then at Moreo. I'm here today because I can't stand by and let this continue. He turned to the judge. I know who took the brooch, Kelechi said, his voice steady. And it wasn't Sephi. The courtroom fell silent. The truth, long buried, began to surface like a tide. Kalechi's words were the key, and as he spoke, Sephi's heart raced. Kalechi's revelation was a game-changer. He knew something that could prove her innocence. The tension in the room shifted as eyes turned from Kalechi to Teo and Moreo. Was this the truth, or just another elaborate scheme? Months ago, before the brooch went missing, Sephi had found herself in Teo's presence more often than not. She had noticed the way he watched her from across the room at dinner parties, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long. And that night, when the lights had dimmed and the last guest had left, Sephi had found herself alone with him in the garden. Teo had approached her slowly, and without thinking, she had stepped into his embrace. He kissed her, not with the urgency of someone trying to consume, but with a slow, aching tenderness that left her breathless. In that moment, Sephi felt as though the walls between them had crumbled. For a moment, there was nothing but the taste of him on her lips, the warmth of his hands at her waist. But then, just as quickly, he pulled away. "We can't," he had whispered, but the look in his eyes said everything. It wasn't just about the brooch or the accusations. It was about something deeper, something they both knew, but neither had the courage to confront. That kiss had opened a door between them, one that neither was ready to walk through. As Kalechi's testimony unraveled the carefully woven web of lies, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Moreo's composure faltered as the truth emerged, piece by piece. The brooch had never disappeared at all. It had been in her possession the entire time. The accusations against Sephi were a carefully orchestrated scheme to remove her from the state, and the reasons behind it went far deeper than anyone had known. Sephi's head spun as she realized the full scope of betrayal. But with the truth out in the open, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. The weight of the false accusations was finally lifted, and with it, a new sense of freedom. Sephi's hands trembled as she looked at Kalechi, who had just saved her. She could see the same fire in his eyes that had once made her heart skip a beat. The years of distance, the silence, the barriers built between them, all of it seemed insignificant now. "Thank you," she whispered. But there was more to say. Kalechi stepped forward, his voice low. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I should have done this long ago." In that moment, everything changed. The walls between them crumbled, and the desire that had lingered for so long finally found a way to be expressed. As the case was closed and Sephi was exonerated, the courtroom buzzed with the sound of the press. But inside her, something more profound had shifted. She had won, yes, but it wasn't just about the brooch or the accusations. It was about reclaiming her own story, about finally stepping into the light that had always been there, just out of reach. Teo's cold demeanor had finally cracked, and as he approached her after the trial, he spoke the words he had been holding back for so long. "I should have believed you," he said, "and I should have told you the truth." Sephi smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of the understanding that the truth, in all its forms, had a way of revealing itself. "It's not too late," she replied softly, her heart racing at the thought of what lay ahead. The end of this chapter marked not only a personal victory for Sephi, but also the beginning of something much deeper. The path to healing was just beginning, and with it, the possibility of something more intimate, more real than either of them had ever known. The emotional weight of their shared history was the perfect foundation for what was about to unfold. Sephi walked out of the courtroom, her steps echoing in the quiet hallway. The weight of the trial was finally behind her, but her mind was not yet at peace. Her chest tightened as the crowd's whispers followed her. Some were expressions of relief, others still unsure of what to make of the situation. She couldn't blame them. The truth had only recently been uncovered, and even now, the air around her felt thick with judgment. She had been dragged to the dirt and back, yet here she was, standing tall and victorious, despite everything. Kalechi followed her, the only person who had stood by her, his voice still lingering in her mind as he had spoken the truth in that courtroom. He had told the world what he knew, but the words had not just shattered the accusations. They had opened a door for them both, one that had been closed for far too long. She couldn't ignore the intensity in his eyes as he spoke, nor the way his hand had brushed hers when he stood beside her. "I'm proud of you," Kalechi said quietly, catching up to her. Sephi paused at the elevator, her fingers curling around the brass handle. She turned to face him, her heart fluttering like a bird desperate for freedom. "You've been more than just proud, Kalechi." She hadn't meant for it to slip out, but the truth had a way of doing that. The years of silence, the longing they had both held on to, it was all suddenly laid bare, and she couldn't hide it anymore. His gaze softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. The crowded courthouse faded into the background, the weight of the accusations forgotten, replaced by a moment of raw, unspoken understanding. She felt the electric tension between them, like the pull of the moon's gravity, undeniable and powerful. She had never allowed herself to admit how deeply she had cared for him, how the quiet moments between them had meant more than she ever let on. The elevator doors opened, and Sephi stepped inside, Kalechi right behind her. The silence was thick between them, as the doors closed with soft chime, sealing them in the space alone. For a brief second, Sephi could feel his presence next to her, so close she could almost feel the heat of his body. Her breath hitched, and she struggled to maintain control of the emotions she had buried for so long. "I can't go back to the way things were," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She was speaking the truth now, not just about the case, but about them. She wasn't sure if he could understand how much of herself she had kept locked away. Kalechi moved closer, his hand gently brushing against hers. He didn't need words to show her that he understood. His touch was enough. "Neither can I," he replied softly. The weight of his words hung in the air, charged with the possibility of what could be, and what had been lost. The first time Sephi had felt a pull toward Kalechi was during a late-night dinner at the Okonkwo estate. The silverware had clinked against the plates as they ate, but her attention was always drawn back to him. There was something in the way he smiled, in the way his eyes lingered on hers, just a fraction longer than was usual for their casual interactions. He had always been polite, but there was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made her heart race every time their paths crossed. It was the night the storm had knocked out the power. The air was thick with humidity, and Sephi had been tasked with ensuring everything in the kitchen was secured. As the rain pounded against the windows, she found herself in the hallway, caught in the storm's chaos, when Kalechi had appeared. His presence was unexpected, yet she felt an undeniable draw to him. "It's too noisy in there," he had said, his voice low and comforting. "I thought you could use a break." The next few moments had unfolded like a slow, deliberate dance. They stepped out onto the terrace, and as the rain soaked the earth around them, their conversation had taken on a new, deeper tone. They spoke about family, about life, about the weight of expectations that pressed on their shoulders. But beneath the surface, there was an electricity that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It was a connection, the understanding, the shared unspoken bond that made Sephi realize just how deeply she had always felt for him. He had stepped closer, and in the dim light of the terrace, he had kissed her. It was soft at first, hesitant even, but then it deepened. A slow, aching realization of desire, of everything they had kept hidden from the world. The kiss was everything they had both suppressed, a promise, and a temptation all at once. But just as quickly, Kalechi had pulled away, his face filled with regret. "We can't," he had said, though his eyes told her everything she needed to know. There were so many reasons why it couldn't happen. Family, loyalty, the line between employer and employee. Yet neither of them could deny the truth that lingered in the air. As Kalechi's testimony unraveled the carefully woven web of lies, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Moreo's composure faltered as the truth emerged, piece by piece. The brooch had never disappeared at all. It had been in her possession the entire time. The accusations against Sephi were a carefully orchestrated scheme to remove her from the house, and the reasons behind it went far deeper than anyone had known. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, and murmurs filled the air. Sephi stood still, her heart racing as Kalechi's words hit like thunder. She had been vindicated, yes, but the emotional toll of the entire situation weighed heavily on her. She had been accused of something she didn't do, and the person responsible had been someone she had trusted. But as the truth was revealed, Sephi felt something else stir inside her, not just relief, but an undeniable sense of empowerment. The weight of the lies had been lifted, and with it, the freedom to embrace a life she had always wanted. As the case was closed and Sephi was exonerated, the courtroom buzzed with the sound of press. But inside her, something more profound had shifted. She had won, yes, but it wasn't just about the brooch or the accusations. It was about reclaiming her own story, about finally stepping into the light that had always been there, just out of reach. Teyo's cold demeanor had finally cracked, and as he approached her after the trial, he spoke the words he had been holding back for so long. "I should have believed you," he said, "and I should have told you the truth." Sephi smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of the understanding that the truth, in all its forms, had a way of revealing itself. "It's not too late," she replied softly, her heart racing at the thought of what lay ahead. The sound of distant carriages and the chatter of reporters outside faded as Sephi walked the courthouse halls, her feet no longer feeling the weight they once did. The victory had been hard-won, but now it tasted sweeter than any false accusation ever could. Yet, in the silence that followed the chaos of the trial, a deeper tension lingered. Her heart still raced, not from fear, but from something else, something far more complicated. The quiet moments with Kalechi, his quiet strength, and the way his eyes followed her across the room, still burned in her memory. Sephi had never imagined that the truth would be so costly, nor did she expect the toll it would take on her heart. The truth, however, had a way of finding its way out. It always did. The moments between them, before the trial had exposed the betrayal, had been filled with questions left unanswered. She had always known the lines were blurred between her and Teyo, but she never expected Kalechi to be the one to tear those lines apart. Yet, now here she stood, caught between the desire she felt for Kalechi and the bitter reality of his family's lies. His actions had given her hope, but would they be enough to heal the wounds inflicted over the years? Kalechi's footsteps approached from behind, breaking her reverie. She turned to face him, her pulse quickening as he stood there, looking like the man she had once known, and the stranger who had come to her rescue all at once. His eyes were filled with something she could not quite place, regret, longing, and a depth of emotion that echoed her own. "I never should have let you carry the weight alone," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there sooner." Sephi shook her head. "You had your reasons," she replied softly, though her heart ached at the memory of those years spent apart. The silence between them seemed endless as she searched for the words to explain the mess of feelings inside her. "I didn't just come here for brooch," Kalechi continued. "I came because you were always meant for more. You were never meant to be trapped in the shadows of this family's lies. You were meant to stand in the light. Sephi, and I—" He hesitated, a flash of vulnerability crossing his features. "I should have seen that long ago." His words hung between them like a confession. But even as the weight of his admission lingered in the air, it wasn't just the apology that struck her. It was the unspoken promise in his eyes. The connection between them was palpable now. No longer just a fleeting moment of attraction, but something deeper, rooted in shared pain, mutual understanding, and the undeniable pull they both felt. Kelechi took a step closer, his hand reaching out. Seffi's breath hitched as his fingers brushed against hers, an electric spark shooting through her body at the simple touch. It was as though the years of distance between them vanished in an instant, but as their hands hovered close, she stopped him. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of longing and restraint. "We can't, not yet." Kelechi's eyes softened. He didn't press further, but he didn't pull away either. Instead, he simply stood there, his hand still lingering in the air between them, a symbol of everything they had been and could still be. "I'm not asking for a yes," Kelechi said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just asking for a chance to prove myself." Seffi closed her eyes as a memory hit her, back to that one night in the garden when everything had changed. The storm outside had rattled the windows, but inside there was an odd calmness. They had been alone, standing at the edge of the estate's sprawling garden, the night air thick with the scent of wet earth. Kelechi had come to her, as he often did when the house was quiet and the world seemed to pause. The tension between them had always been there, unspoken and undeniable. And that night, when Kelechi had stepped closer, a magnetic pull had drawn them together. She had felt the intensity of his gaze before he leaned in and kissed her, a kiss slow, hesitant, but filled with so much longing. It had been the kind of kiss that broke barriers, that shattered walls, but just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. "I'm sorry," Kelechi had said, pulling away just as she had given herself over to the kiss. "I didn't mean to cross that line." But the line had already been crossed, and they both knew it. The words hung in the air, but neither of them had moved. Instead, they stood in the quiet garden, surrounded by the sounds of storm, knowing that something irreversible had just begun. As the court proceedings came to an end, the room was filled with an intense silence. The judge had made her final ruling. Seffi was exonerated, her name cleared of the theft accusation that had plagued her for so long. Yet, even as the courtroom erupted into applause, Seffi couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. The truth had been revealed, yes, but it had come at a cost. The person she had trusted the most, Teo, had betrayed her, and the revelation had shaken her to the core. But it was Kelechi who had saved her. His testimony had been the turning point. And as she looked at him now, standing beside her in the courtroom, she saw him not as the estranged son of a powerful family, but as a man who had finally chosen to stand by her, to fight for her. Seffi didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. The truth had set her free. She no longer needed to live in the shadows of lies, and she didn't need to stand alone. The emotional burden of the trial had been heavy, but the sense of relief that washed over her now was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Teo stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. He had failed her, but Kelechi had not. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the room, Seffi knew that the future would be different. It would be a future she would choose for herself. Seffi walked out of the courthouse, her heart light, but her mind still racing. Kelechi had stayed behind for a moment, but he was soon by her side. Together, they walked down the steps, the city sprawling out before them like an open invitation. "I don't know what comes next," Seffi said, her voice soft but steady. "But for the first time, I think I'm ready to find out." Kelechi's hand brushed against hers again, this time with more certainty. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They had both been through too much to leave it all behind. And as they walked together, side by side, Seffi couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Hope for a future built on truth, trust, and the possibility of love. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning of their story. As they walked down the courthouse steps, the world outside felt entirely different to Seffi. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden light over the city of Lagos. She breathed deeply. the air feeling fresher than it had in months. The trial, the accusation, the weight of the lies, everything that defined her life for so long, was now behind her. But there was still a lingering question in the air between her and Kelechi. She couldn't ignore it, no matter how much she wanted to. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper as they walked side by side. The sound of their footsteps seemed louder now, echoing to the silence that had settled between them. Kelechi didn't immediately respond. His gaze was fixed ahead, but she could feel his awareness of her question. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "We rebuild," he said simply. Sephi glanced at him, and for a moment she saw the boy she had once known, young, impulsive, full of anger and guilt, and the man who had stood up for her in court, protecting her from the lies of his own family. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, something that drew her in despite the years and the pain that lay between them. "We rebuild," she repeated softly, tasting the idea of it. It felt like a promise not just to her, but to herself. After everything, she was still here. She was still standing. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for something more. They continued walking, their paths winding through the city as they slowly made their way to the street where Kelechi's car was parked. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and Sephi could sense the tension building between them again. The desire that had once been so carefully hidden was now undeniable, and it wasn't just a passion from their earlier moment in the courtroom. It was something more, something that had been building for years, a longing that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. But just as the pull between them seemed ready to snap, Kelechi stopped walking and turned to face her. The movement was sudden, and Sephi's heart skipped a beat. His eyes were searching hers, as though he were trying to read every thought in her mind. "Sephi," he said, his voice raw, "I can't pretend anymore." She blinked, a knot forming in her throat. "Pretend? What do you mean?" He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. For a moment, the world seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, standing in the fading light of the day, the city moving around them like a distant hum. "I've been pretending all this time," Kelechi admitted, his voice a mixture of pain and yearning. "Pretending that I could stay away, pretending that this," he gestured between them, his hand still lingering near her face, "wasn't real. But it is, Sephi. It always has been." Sephi's heart hammered in her chest. The words were everything she wanted to hear, yet she still hesitated. The truth of their situation was far from simple. He was still the son of the woman who had accused her. She had spent years keeping her distance from him, afraid of what could happen if they let their feelings take root. But the truth was undeniable. Their connection, the emotional weight of their history, could no longer be ignored. "Kelechi," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she had held back. Her hands reached up, finding his, and she felt the warmth of his fingers against her skin. "Sephi," he said again, his tone steady but filled with something deeper. "Don't fight this anymore. Don't fight me anymore." The words were a plea, and it was all the permission she needed. In that moment, everything shifted. The past, the lies, the fears, all of it melted away, and what remained was the undeniable truth of what they had always felt for each other, the love that had been buried for so long. Sephi didn't pull away as he leaned down, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was soft but intense. It wasn't just passion. It was years of suppressed desire, of untold truths, of everything that had led them here. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of loss, of finding something again that neither of them had ever truly let go of. She responded, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, her hands threading through his hair. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, The world outside them no longer existed. All that mattered was this moment, this connection. The way his lips moved against hers, as though they had both been waiting for this. It wasn't the first time they had been alone together, but it was the first time Sephi had truly felt the heat between them. She remembered the last summer before the accusations, the summer when everything between them had started to change. There had been no grand gesture, no bold declaration, just a quiet evening when Teo was out of town, and Kelechi had invited her for a walk in the garden. The evening had been warm, the kind of warmth that made the air feel heavy and alive. As they strolled among the flowers, Kelechi had talked about everything and nothing. Family, work, life. But all the while, there's this undercurrent, this awareness that they were no longer just employer and employee. There was something else. She remembered the first time he touched her. His fingers brushed against the back of her hand, lightly, almost accidentally. But the spark that surged between them was immediate. Her heart had skipped a beat, and she had quickly pulled her hand back, afraid of what it meant. But Kelechi hadn't pulled away. He had smiled softly, and in that smile, she had seen a glimmer of the man he could be. It was that moment, the briefest touch, that had changed everything. Back in the present, as they pulled away from the kiss, Sephi's eyes fluttered open to meet Kelechi's gaze. There was a sense of completeness in his eyes, as though they had both finally come full circle. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by something more profound, an understanding of what they meant to each other, an acceptance of the life they could build together. What happens now? Sephi asked again, her voice barely a whisper, her hand still resting in his. Kelechi smiled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Now we build something that's ours. No more lies, no more distance. And for the first time, Sephi believed him. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever it was, they would face it together. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. The world seemed to slow as Kelechi and Sephi stood there, hand in hand, a silent promise between them. They had both endured so much to get here, but now, with the truth laid bare, they were free to move forward, together. And as the day turned to night, they both knew this was only the beginning of something real, something beautiful, something they'd fought for, and now, finally, they had